This is wonderful. Kalinga Literary Festival once again hosts us in its Bhasha Utsav, which I think is just so appropriate for the kind of work that we are doing together as a collective. And Bhasha Utsav does mean that we bring in subjects which are of direct interest to all of us who are dealing with multilinguality, who are dealing with literatures, languages, etc. in India. And I'm really grateful to Kalinga Literary Festival for providing this platform to us. And this obviously is with great enthusiasm that we've entered this platform, that we are on this platform. This is perhaps our sixth episode that we are actually, in a way, not performing as such, but basically indulging in a discussion. We started with reference to, and we continue to do that with reference to a series of books that are happening under the title Writer in Context. And we have already published two books in this context. And there are many, many issues that come out or emerge out of this particular domain, area of study, as it were, that we are looking at the post-independence modern Indian literature. And if the selection is that of a writer in any Indian language to basically to be focused upon, then we are not just focusing on the writer because it is the writer in context. We are also therefore in the book looking at the various themes that the writer has emerged out of which one of the major themes is tradition and modernity, about which we've already had a discussion. We've already introduced the series of books in the first episode, after which we focused on two books that have come out, one on Krishna Sokti and the other one on Joginder Paul. And then after that, we had a long discussion. Most of these discussions are amongst the editors of the books that are happening. And so they are very deeply involved and engaged in thinking and doing and writing of the issues that have come up. One of the issues that we have already had a discussion on is regarding multilingualism, the way we understand it, and also to put the writer in the context of a multilingual, literatures that are happening all the time in our country. Then the last episode was to do with tradition and modernity, modernism, and I think it was a very vibrant discussion. And today we are moving on to yet another discussion, which is to do with the shifts in language that happened, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in modern Indian literature, of which also means in many languages, therefore. And these shifts happened, yes, in the original languages, which very courageously the writers took on. But we must remember dealing with, in our context, we are dealing with literatures of many languages in translation. So translation in itself also becomes a subject to reckon with, to understand, and see what kind of transformations have happened and what are the challenges of the translators. I'm very happy to be accompanied. It's almost like a chorus that we have amongst ourselves, because I'm happy to have three of the very prominent translators in the country. All of them are also editors, academics, translators, and appreciators of literatures, and that too Indian literature, both what we call literatures that come out of the margins and the so-called mainstream literatures, and the truck between the two, I think. So I'm very happy to be introducing them all. All of us here are gathered basically. Most of us are people who are doing books in the Writer in Context series. To start with, I would like to introduce the co-editor with me of the series, Chandana Datta, who is an author, editor, translator, and holds, she's a PhD from JNU and has been involved with Katha Vilasam as assistant director. And we must remember that Katha was or is rather, an organization that pioneered translation in India. Not just that, I mean, Chandana went on to also set up a publishing outfit called India Log. And she was the chief editor there, also editor of Indian Horizons, a quarterly journal that came out of ICCR, New Delhi, adjunct faculty for the master's program in publishing at Ambedkar University, Delhi. She also she's a bilingual, a strong bilingual who translates from Hindi and Bangla into English. She's author of My Other Half, Krishna Paul in Conversation with Chandana Datta, is the title of the book, which was published in 2019, followed by a monograph that she worked on Joginder Paul, which was published by Sahitya Academy. And she has also published the second volume that came out of Writer in Context. She's the one who edited this volume on Joginder Paul. And well, we are fighting the battle. We are trying to, Chandana and I are, it's like fighting a battle with joy without killing anyone, I hope, and enjoying doing these books, which are as of now 11 books in the making. Over to now Professor Vibha Chauhan. Vibha has also been is associated with Writer in Context, doing a book on Fanishwanath Renu, who is a very, very prominent Hindi writer. But she has been associated with a lot of work that we have been doing for a very long time. I think all of us have been working together on many issues, engaged therefore in this project also together. She's the principal of Kirorimal College at the University of Delhi, again a multilingual, proficient in Hindi, English, Bhojpuri, an editor, a translator, and she has written widely across these languages in the original, and her critical works cover a wide range of academic interests, including indigenous literatures, cultures, modernity, modernism, Dalit literature, marginalized communities, and performance studies. So, looking forward to listening to you, Vibha. And yes, now next to Kirti Ramachandra, who is a great friend and who's been, I think, editing books for all of us, So, she's the chief here in one sense. So, she's a teacher who has aptitude, inclination, training. Um, uh, in a big way in the whole idea of teaching, but also a translator by virtue of being multilingual and an editor by default, as she calls it. Having taught English at all levels and conducted translation workshops till recently, she now concentrates on translation mainly, which she loves, and she edits, from which she has trained herself to learn from. With three collections of short stories, two novels, couple of autobiographies, all translated from Marathi. Her short stories translated from Hindi, Kannada, Marathi have appeared in anthologies in India and abroad. And she's a very passionate translator, we know, and she can fight tooth and nail to argue a point if she takes it on. So beware, she's a person of conviction and of experience. I am really looking forward to this discussion that we are going to have. The post-independence Indian literature in many
Sukrita,
languages, broadly the canvas. Yeah,
Sukrita, if I
Chandana?
may just interrupt for a minute,
Yeah, sure,
may I
sure.
please introduce you also?
Oh,
Uh,
okay, right.
a mentor to many of us, certainly to me, Sukrita Paul Kumar, former fellow of the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, held the prestigious Aruna Asaf Ali Chair at Delhi University. She was an honorary faculty at Corfu, Greece. She was an invited resident poet at the prestigious International Writing Program at Iowa, USA. Her most recent collections of poems are Vanishing Birds, Country Drive, and Dreamcatcher. Her critical books include Narrating Partition, The New Story, and Conversations on Modernism. She's also a painter. She is co-editor of the series of books under Writer in Context. She has also for the series in edited the volume Krishna Sopti, a counter archive, and she's exhibited her paintings in several places. So that is not the least of the descriptions that I would like to introduce Sukrita with. Thank you, Sukrita, for everything.
Thank you, Chandana. Thank you very much. I think we better get on to the business of discussion now. But needless to say that, I'm repeating this, but needless to say that in the post independence Indian literary scene, there was suddenly so many things happening with a spirit of resurgence, because on the one hand there was this the spirit of freedom, independence, euphoria, etc. But on the other hand, there was also partition that happened, which kind of caused a certain crisis of culture, and not just in the languages of the northern India. Of course, northern India was much more affected, but needless to say that in the south also, whether it's in Marathi or in Malayalam or Bangla or other languages, there was a certain kind of a both the like what happened in the case of world wars in the West, and that culture of crisis led to partly helped create a kind of spirit of modernism and all of that in the West. But in our context, I see partition personally, and I'm sure most people would agree with that, that partition was a very big cataclysmic kind of event that happened, phenomenal, in such a way that even if we were not directly involved in it at that time, there were people who got affected by it. And as a result of that, there is after all, literature is all the time reflecting reality outside. And by the time we come to the 60s and 70s, in most literatures of many languages in India, there seemed to be a kind of a paradigm shift happening in the thematic content as well as in the use of language. And our theme today is more to do with language shifts. And the way that happened was that the articulation of the writer had to change with the new, had to battle with the new and learn to express what is the new. Which is not to say that all of this happened suddenly, because there was the precursor in writers like Premchand who affected Urdu, Hindi, Punjabi, particularly in a big way. And there came the movement of progressive writing, which writers had to either align themselves with or get influenced alongside the shadow of Western modernism and the advent of modernity on the scene. So, if this is the kind of scene sociologically that the writer was facing, the there was a fresh approach to language that had to come into being, and the writer had to be very courageous in bringing that out in terms of articulation, literary articulation. And now there was the question of acceptability. I think I would like to ask, first of all, let me call upon, shall I say, Chandana, if you can take it on, as to what is it that you think, particularly because you're dealing with Urdu, Hindi, Punjabi scene. That these are the authors, and you know of Bangla as well. So, what do you think? What is it that made the writer, um, totally change his or her perspective to the use of language? What do you think is the basic? What was the basic need? What was the compulsion?
If I, Sukrita, the way I see this question that you've put up, particularly in the context of the writer that I have worked with, and in a larger sense, I think what was happening was not just, I mean, there was this whole change of, the political change in the country. Along, independence was happening, and it was a big thing that was happening. Most people were involved in it, and the writers were certainly extremely dedicated to this idea of independence, to the question of freedom. Along with that, of course, partition in the northern belt, as you have put it, particularly for writers of Urdu, Hindi, Punjabi, and certainly for the writer that I have worked with, Paul. The partition became a turning point, so to say, for the kind of consciousness that they had uh, within themselves. And that naturally reflected itself in the creative consciousness that they later worked with. um, you know what was happening was most of these writers, many of these writers actually, were also extremely educated writers. They were very well entrenched, maybe not all. I think Kirti would like to point out differently for the writer she is working with, but many of these writers, they were educated in English. Sometimes they went on to become teachers of English as well. So there was this very deep seated sense in them, one of where they came from to what they were exposed to. And most of them treated writing as a vocation. To my mind, writing was really a vocation through which they were conveying what they felt deeply about themselves as people. And they wanted to pull everybody along with it, so the new consciousness of who the reader is also developed along with it. And when this was happening, I think you mentioned progressive writing, and then, of course, there was modernist writing or modernism. And then, of course, we go on to postmodernism. But what was happening really is that a lot of these writers actually were shifting the consciousness inside themselves. It was a very interiorized uh, a look at how they looked at issues around themselves and how they conveyed it. So, coming from a certain tradition or convention, if that is how we have to put it, they were not denying that. They were very aware of it, and without that awareness, I think they could not have been as open, as free in their minds, which is why I feel that most of these writers were very modern. And I use that word modern in a very specific sense. I'm not calling them modernist or using modernisms in their writings. I'm saying they were very modern because they were very open in their acceptance of what was happening, their own place in the scheme of things, of where they were coming from, and what they were meant to do as writers. So this whole process of creativity, the consciousness that they had for creativity and how it changed their aesthetic sensibilities, I think this is what I see as being the larger legacy that we take away from this group of writers that we are broadly calling post independence, modern Indian writer in the bhashas, in the Indian languages. And they are doing wonderful things with their language. Many of them are using language in completely different ways from where they have seen it grow. It's not as if they are completely rejecting that language. But particularly, if I was to just quickly mention here before we move on, in the case of Joginder Paul, he is actually turning the form or the structure of how he creates fiction around completely. And naturally, when he does that, the language that he uses has to fit into this new kind of consciousness of form that he is working with. And this is the larger picture, Sukrita, that I see as, uh, you know, uh, as the unique trait of these writers of this broad phase that we are talking about.
Hmm. So it raises a wonderful point about how the writer at this point of time suddenly becomes, or rather over the years becomes, a very self-reflexive kind of
Mm,
a
mm,
writer who is conscious of what is happening, a writer who is somewhere rejecting convention because what he or she wants to say does not measure up, or rather cannot be articulated in what is the old form of writing. So I think even if it is Premchand, and except for the last few short stories by Premchand, which includes a story like Kafan, I think it's where you begin to see Premchand as a kind of a precursor of modernist thinking. It was very contemporary. So beginning with that, on to the whole idea of how do I want to say what I feel in my consciousness as reality. How do I interpret this reality? And to realize that now, and we're talking about post independence, which also means that there is suddenly this idea that I have to come into myself. I have to come into my own self. And I have that freedom to use language the way I want to use it. And I'm out of the didactic miracle story which used to be written earlier. And so, coming to this domain and self reflexivity that I want to focus on, and Vibha, in that context, I think I would like to raise this point. And as far as your ideas are concerned, about how is it that you're dealing with Phanishwanath Renu in as far as your author of focus is concerned in Writer in Context series, and you're doing a volume in that. Do you think the writer was very self reflexive? Was he thinking about what he was doing? We know that he is the writer who was being referred to by others as someone who pioneered, or rather championed, the cause of Anchalik writing. And this whole Anchalikta, how would you see it, and how would you see the language coming to sort of receive a change very naturally? But it was obviously with a great deal of self-consciousness that the author is making use of that language. There is a paradigm shift. It's not a standard Hindi. So, what would be your comments, and how would you understand this self reflexivity, the author's own consciousness about change of language, and the reception of this language by others?
Yeah, thank you, Sukrita. I think you have touched one of the very core areas of not just Renu, but several other writers in different languages in India. Now, as far as Renu is concerned, Phanishwanath Renu, we get to know several of his own ideas about Anchalikta as well as language through some of his brief but very focused memoirs and some of the interviews where he has discussed this himself. He actually he talks of several things, and he is conscious about not just the language but the community of people who speak that language. And to him, there is no divorce between the two. When he says, when he uses a language, he uses the language of the people that he is writing about. And how does he get to select who or which is the community, who are the people, which is the community he'll write about? That is a very, very strongly autobiographical thing about his childhood, his very active participation in the liberation movement of Nepal as a young boy, in the Quit India movement, and very strong socialist leanings. And he actually posits this whole idea of a region within the discourse of a democratic agenda. And to him, this space of the community, which he connects with the language and the people who speak that language, is something that he does want to express as a part of bring it to the mainstream of literature. And I think it is for this reason that Catherine Hansen actually calls the Anchalik novel a novel of about a new morality as such. Now, morality can be argued, but what she means probably is giving voice to those who had been voiceless till that point of time. Now, Renu himself has expressed how if he had written the dialogues, actually his novel, let me talk of Mela Aanchal, since that is his best piece and best known novel, his first novel that brought him into limelight. And one of the first critics, Nalin Vilochan Sharma, he in fact has written that if Renu does not write anything else, this will give him fame and immortality. So here, what he says is that he has the dialogue of his characters are in a language which he constructs. If one goes to the village, I visited his village, even today, one finds people speaking Maithili, Magahi, Urdu, and also English, words in English like sosling and inspector and so on, Hindi, Khadi Boli. And he says that if he had written this in the language of the people he talks about, it would have been incomprehensible to the readers of Hindi. Yet, if he had written it in Khadi Boli, that would have been totally artificial. And so he strikes a middle ground. He himself says it's the middle ground of combining the local with the Khadi Boli. And what he focuses on is the rhythm and the modulation. So these are dialogues that if read aloud, there would be a certain rhythm, and those who know the region would be able to locate exactly which region it comes from. The other commentary, his own comments, they are in Khadi Boli. So he combines the two, and he says actually the language of the characters is what he says Kachahri Boli. The official language used in the courts is what it's similar to that. So that is one of the major things which he keeps saying, and he does say that Anchalikta is not just about language. Language is only one aspect of it. Anchalikta is about recreating a region and connecting the subjectivity, interiority of the characters with the mainstream. So always kind of locating it within a wider agenda. So he himself, he in fact says that I probably made a mistake when I wrote the title Mela Aanchal. Just below that in brackets, he wrote Ek Anchalik Upanyas, and Anchalik novel, loosely translated as a regional novel. And he says, I wrote it because of the language used. And I got to understand it better after I read the critics who wrote about Anchalikta. So, he says that I now have to learn to defend it and define it. And he does it in many different places.
Excellent. Excellent. And I think is the fact that he wrote, and also you brought in that point about, about people, how would they respond to it? And I'm not sure about the reception of Anchalikta immediately, but I know that the author I worked on, Krishna Sopti, was forever talking about Vanishwanath Renu as a model, because he's the one who opened the doors for her and said, "Here you are. You can actually accommodate a difference in the use of Hindi language. It need not be the Pandit's Hindi pure language, Shuddha Hindi. The purity can be flouted. It can easily be flouted, and it need not be used as a scholar would use it." So the creativity that was involved in in a way abusing mainstream language, right? In a way playing with it. And as you rightly put it, it's not as if he picked up the local language and put it there. It is the tonal quality, and it's a certain kind of musical rhythm to it, you know. Also, maybe you would know better, but maybe the kind of humor or the kind of witticisms that you see, or the use of metaphors or similes, you know, he
Yes.
would pick up from the local place, from the region, from that area. Would I be right
Yeah,
when I would say that? Hmm.
certainly, certainly, because actually his writing is seen as a holistic sensorium as such, the
Hmm.
sensuousness of, and his use of music, his use of folk songs, folklore, folk humor, sometimes difficult not just to catch, but even to express. So, and that's what I mean by the rhythmic quality. Now, his folk songs, and it is not just in the songs that there is a rhythm. It's when he is writing prose. You see,
Yeah.
there is a harmony, which again Nalin Vilochan Sharma himself has also pointed out. He says, in fact, he says that creation of harmony, from what several critics have referred to as muddying the water of Hindi writing and
Hmm.
Hindi literature,
Hmm.
Hindi prose. He says
Hmm.
actually this harmony, which is seen as muddying the waters, is the only poetic license that the writer takes. So it
Hmm.
is extremely very close to poetry because it becomes actually uh, not just simple prose. It becomes it combines many different things. In fact, it can there are parts of it which could be placed in magical realism, uh, along with being carrying the social realism of Premchand. You
Hmm.
see, they denote many different things. In fact, it is difficult to slot Renu in any one category, because while he is seen as a post independent writer, of course, but at many different levels and theoretically, in the present theoretical frameworks, he can very easily be located in theoretical approaches like what is known as orature, and very recent Welty studies, which bring in the rhythms, the music, the dreams he of living languages. And these languages actually are still living. And
Yeah.
he, in that sense, he transcends these very, very sometimes what we see as sacred oppositions or binaries,
Yeah.
like reality and fiction and dream and reality and social realism. And he kind of he transcends and traverses through many of these simultaneously, and through the vehicle of this transference of meaning through the language that he creates. He
Yeah.
crafts this language,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
but he does not isolate craftsmanship from sensibility, sensitivity, and the carrying, I would not like to say meaning, but meaning only, because that also has several connotations, but the major content as such of what he wants to
Yeah.
communicate.
It's very holistic, the approach. And I'm quite sure, thank you, Vibha. I'm quite sure that Kirti is wanting to pitch in here, because the author that she deals with is Madgulkar. And Madgulkar is known for his um, in a nutshell, I mean, as a non-Maharashtrian, if I may put it, immediately as a Grameen writer, right? Or not Grameen writer himself, but dealing with subjects which are actually, again, in one sense, Anchalic, and yet there is a difference there. And of course, we'll come to the translation bit later, but I think to talk about Markulkar in the sense of how and what is the specific use of, what did he do to Marathi? It was obviously he was dealing with subjects which were quite different from other people's. His the nature of experiences, his biography, his memoirs tell us is very different, from many of the other writers. And each writer, by the way, obviously we have to realize every writer's uniqueness. And in this case, the uniqueness of Madgulkar comes across to us when we read how he's in a way labeled as Grameen writer, right? So, Kirti, what would you have to say about what made him? What are the differences that you see in Marathi original of how he's dealing with, or distorting? Is he distorting the mainstream Marathi? What is the Marathi that he's using? What is the shift that happens in the use of language in as far as he's concerned?
Sukrita, Madgulkar is different from all other writers of his time for two reasons. One is he's completely unself conscious in the way he writes. He has absolutely no concern, if I may say so, conscious concern about structure, about technique, about language. And what he was trying to do was recreate this region called Mandesh, which is in South Maharashtra. And it's a very dry, arid, desolate kind of a region. And the people of that region is what he was interested in. But that was not his only interest. He was interested in flora, fauna, he was interested in jungles, he was interested in the customs, the traditions, the folklore. So, if, as somebody put it, you know, Madgulkar took storytelling or the short story from the living room of urban elite, if I may say so, and took it to the banyan tree, to the chavdi, or the platform around the village, the center, the marketplace, and sat there and told the stories. You get the feeling that that's what he did. And therefore, there are no literary flourishes, there are no grand metaphors, or there is no I wouldn't say, but there's a lot of rhythm, there's a lot of music, there is a lot of naturalness and spontaneity in his storytelling. The second, and to highlight this difference, I'd like to compare him with two other people. One is Gangadhar Gadgil. Now, Gangadhar Gadgil was a contemporary of Madgulkar's. Both of them came from a Brahmin family background. Gadgil was highly educated. Madgulkar had no education. He left school at the age of, in class 4. And then he went away on his own to study painting, didn't succeed, came back. At age 19, he published a short story, which won him a prize. And he was encouraged to write by the publisher of that magazine in which Abhiruchi, in which he published that story and where he won that contest. The second, these are the, then he was given a job in the magazine where he worked for 2 months and he hated it because he was confined to this sweaty, hot room where he was supposed to edit or write. And he would much rather have gone down to the basement where there was this artist in doing the illustrations and paintings because he always wanted to be a painter. Then he went back home and he decided that his older brother had already become very famous as a poet, as a screenplay writer, and writer of short stories and lyrics for Marathi films. So he said, I knew I was going to be different. I wanted to be different from my brother. He got out of the shadow of his brother and went to Bombay and started working on his painting, and then took up a job with All India Radio. So this is his background. He was introduced to English novels by Gangadhar Gadgil. He taught himself English. He read Orwell and Steinbeck and authors of that caliber with the help of a dictionary, completely self-taught. So all this business about psychoanalysis and getting into the head of the character and analyzing what makes him tick didn't appeal to him, or didn't come to him. What he studied was what he imbibed from his vast and extensive reading of Western authors, some of them in translation, but many of them. Whereas Gadgil was a highly educated man, and his other contemporaries, Mirasdar, Patil, they were all professors of English in different institutions. So when they wrote with a completely different sensibility. They paid a lot of attention to technique, to the art, the craft of writing stories. Gargill took the story away from the upper middle class, upper caste background and their concerns and their issues of life and brought it down to the chawl in Bombay, to the urban lower middle class sensibility. And that's what he wrote about very sensitively, very authentically. But the authenticism was because he could understand, apply his mind uh, to their behavior patterns and analyze that. But he was always an outsider. Madgulkar never considered himself an outsider. He wanted to write from the inside, and that is what makes his writing different. You know, now, as far as what he did to language, none of them, Sukrita, distorted the English Marathi language. They only depicted the voice of the people in the manner in which it was heard and spoken. So Annabhav Sathe, who is also a little senior to Madgulkar, who wrote Fakira about the Mang community to which he belonged, the untouchable, the lowest rung of the lower castes. He wrote about them, but he wrote as an insider. And therefore, he wrote with a different kind of a passion and a zeal. Madgulkar wrote with a sense of empowering these people, not with any judgment, not but lots of empathy. He wanted to present these characters as they were. So you can say that his short stories are more character sketches, and his character sketches have events that make them into short stories. There is a kind of structure. But all of them use the standard in Marathi in their writing up till 1978. At 1978, the shift happens when all the people that Madgulkar and Annabhav Sathe and the others were talking about got a voice, the Dalit writers, as we call them today. And they started writing in their own language, the dialect. Now, had they Madgulkar written in that dialect, probably people from South Maharashtra would not be able to understand what he was, or people from North Maharashtra would not be able to understand, or people from Marathwada would not be able to understand what he was writing. So they all use standard Marathi except in the dialogues. That was a very striking difference I found, because I've translated Gadgil, I've translated Annabhav Sathe, and I've translated Madgulkar. So I know how it differs. There are certain stock phrases which all of them use to describe, let's say, silence, to describe rain, to describe twilight or the sunrise. You find the same expressions even in Vishwas Patil, who's writing today. So that way, there hasn't been any major shift in language, though the writers of today who call themselves as Dalit writers are using language exactly as they know it. But as somebody again said, that education has made all of these writers conscious of what is available to them and of other languages. And therefore, when in their own writing, there's a lot of Hindi, there's a lot of influence of film music, film dialogues, there is a lot of use of English, because the rural Dalit communities are getting educated. All of them are first generation learners, but they're exposed to all of this. So their language is also getting mixed with the local
Yeah.
or the language of the street today.
Yeah. So there's obviously, a marked kind of what you said was what I see as the difference is that there was a kind of a spontaneity, even if it would have been a studied spontaneity, because spontaneity to make something spontaneous, to write something which sort of is giving the semblance of spontaneity, would also mean a certain kind of an effort. So the self consciousness is not apparently there. It's like what we say, art lies in concealing art. So surely, when he's conscious of making it spontaneous, there is a simplicity of a kind. And anyway, so there isn't a major change in Marathi language as such, except that it would probably be more rural in nature, and that is why it is called Grameen. And so that apart, I think we could now take another round, and maybe with you, we could start now, Kirti, talking about translation. Because you said that you've been translating all the other writers as well, along with Madgulkar. Now, when you are translating these writers, and that's where you begin to see the difference in language also. But how do you bring that difference in the use of Marathi in English language is of interest to me, because as a translator, or as a reader rather, when I am going to read Gadgil or Madgulkar, because I don't know Marathi, I'm going to read them in English. How would I see that their use of language is different? What do you do to translate them to bring in that difference in English language?
Well, spend a lot of sleepless nights for one thing, because you're always struggling with how to get that rhythm, that intonation. Because Sukrita, Marathi, and like other Indian languages, bhashas, does not have the structure, a fixed structure. English has a very fixed structure, sentence structure, a pattern. To be Now in Marathi, Kannada, wherever, all of them have a very different sentence structure. Now the only way you can bring out this difference is by playing with the sentence structures. Now in Kannada, the verb comes at the end of the sentence always, because that element of surprise comes with the action, and most writers use that technique. It's very similar in Marathi. Now the only way I feel I can do this to show the difference in English, that this is not standard Marathi or this is not standard English, is to use inversions. Now, not use a question where there's a statement, use a question without a question tag, because how else does one present or translate these features? Or you have sometimes sentences which are not grammatically correct, which is unfair to the original, because Grameen Bhasha always has a grammar, but it is used subconsciously, intuitively. It is not ungrammatical when you say Vaiki. That is henna. Exactly that. When in Hindi you say nahi kya. In our kind of Hindi we say nahi kya. I say nahi kya. Now when they say vai kya, there's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly. It's an emphatic uh, statement, or a beginning of a sentence. How else do you do it? Either you retain it, or you say you wouldn't come. After thinking so long, I decided to go. Now, that would be a very standard English sentence. But she says, thinking, halt, decided, go I must. Now, this is what it sounds like in Marathi. विचार करून आता शेवटी जायला निघाले. That's how it sounds. Now, when you say these things, it is much easier to convey the difference between what, let's say, the Deshmukh of that city, of that village, who is an upper caste Brahmin, would say, and how this woman who's going to the bazaar would speak. So that has to, I can think of only playing with the structure of these sentences within quotes. I can't do
Yeah.
very much else. Literal translation of some idioms and proverbs does work. It works very well in some cases. Sometimes it becomes a little absurd. So I don't like to use too many, retain too many of the original language words, but I do think sometimes it's necessary. Like this expression, Vaiki. She starts every sentence with almost every sentence with that. So the first time I would translate it and then just repeat Vaiki as later on. It's only a
Yeah.
response.
Yeah.
So that's what I would do.
Yeah.
And
So I
oh,
think that.
one quick point, most of these languages are onomatopoeic. They use words like dhadam, khadak, ghada, 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 king, 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 king. You know, they would use things. They would not say clutter, they would not say bang, they would not say clatter, they would not say clang, because there are no verbs in Marathi for that. Now, that becomes also an issue where one tends to use these sounds rather than words.
But are they not accepted now? The usage of these sounds, for instance, because onomatopoeia would be, in any case, acceptable in English, wouldn't it? Or would it sound very awkward? And therefore, there would be a critic saying, well, this is not English or something like that. And therefore, are you kind of conscious of that, that you should not, you should retain the what, how should I put it, the Englishness would disappear. But that's what we want, don't we? We have to create a readership for translated texts, and these interventions would be, I think, very important, and that would be as true for maybe Vibha's author, where Anchalik writing is happening, where there are actual interventions by the author in terms of changing the language and again bringing in musicality of sorts. There is a sense of rhythm which is not the same as in the rhythm in English. So, in that context, I'm also thinking of Raja Rao, who said that in his preface to Kathapura, he's saying it very clearly. He says, if you listen to my English, if you listen to it, he's saying not reading, he says, if you listen to my rendering of dialogue or even narrative, there would be the Kannada rhythm in that. There would be an inbuilt Kannada rhythm in the prose that I write, because I have to think like, or I have to talk like a Kannada person. Why would I do it? Why would I anglicize it? Now, that was a very big departure that he is making and validating the intermingling, in a way, of Kannada with the English. It would be the soul would be Kannada, but the apparel is English, right? The dress is English. And would you say that, Vibha, how does it work, with somebody like Renu, for instance?
Yeah, you're right. One does think of Raja Rao's preface several times. But the only difference is that he is talking of original writing. And when we work as translators, I think it's a very tightrope walk. I find it almost a disciplining kind of writing. It's a tightrope because one cannot depart from the original sense that the writer is trying to communicate. One should be able to communicate the modulation, the tone, the rhythm, and yet the creativity of translation as well as the original writing, as far as possible, be brought in. So it's a pretty difficult take for the kind of that inversions that Kirti is talking of. That is at one level the structure of the language difficult. If some in Tisri Kasam, for instance, I was reminded of it when the heroine asks Hira, man, what naam kya hai tumhara? He says, Hira hai mera naam. So my name is Hira does not communicate it.
Yeah.
And so these things one has to kind of take decision. And these, as far as Renu is concerned, this is somewhat a simpler problem to deal with compared to his very hybrid language, where even his original language is challenged. How far can one call it really Hindi? So, in fact, the two major charges charges as such which Renu was confronted with after publication of Mela Anchal was one of contaminating of Hindi language, and the other was that it would be difficult to translate this language in other languages. So these, he in fact has responded to both, and in one of his small pieces, like I mentioned earlier, he actually mentions several writers from different languages of the world, like Shloka of the Virgin Soil, Unturned, and I have a list of some, and Hanson's Growth of Soil. He's a writer from Norway. He talks of William Faulkner. He talks of them as being Anchalic because he says they recreate their region. They talk of, uh, uh, if it can be translated, something like collective specificity, characters who are specific yet part of the collective. So it's not that there is a wide brush, these get combined. He even talks of uh, somebody from Serbia, Ivo Andrić, whose novel was translated in Hindi, Trina Nadi ke Kagar par. So he was very well read actually about novels and from different languages, and if they were translated in Hindi, of course, and available, he had read these. And so he says that if these novels can be translated, certainly we have to generate and create ways and means of translating the language of people of this region, the region he writes about. And it's interesting that Mela Anchal actually was translated in Polish. We often feel that it's easier to translate from one Indian language to another, from Bangla to Hindi, for instance, rather than languages from different language families. But this was translated in Polish, and there is an article by Abdul Bismillah, who visited Poland, and he talked to the translator. And the translator was very surprised that why should anybody assume that the translation is difficult. So he had found his own equivalents for terms like zamindar,
Yeah.
his own cultural equivalent for the gentleman, the aristocrat. And the interesting thing was that he said that Mela Anchal was sold off in its Polish translation, and the readers wrote back to say that it reminded them of the region of Lithuania, the whole
Oh.
Anchal, which that time was a part of Poland. And he said that was all
Yeah.
sold off,
Yeah.
and people were happy
Yeah.
and felt connected with it.
Yeah. But
So,
it's yeah, it is strange because you see that's a very highly debatable point as to how can the locale be totally changed, and though it sounds more authentic, but then at the same time it becomes another original. You are transporting the entire Anchal to some other Anchal, right? But anyway,
yes,
those are debates I think we have to deal with in a larger, longer session perhaps. But these are the issues. And also, Chandana, one last question to you, which I think, in as far as your author is concerned, there again there is one very interesting point that comes to my mind, which is the nature of multilinguality there in a different way. Like there is an admixture of, say, Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, and
Yes.
Punjabi too would be, is it this side of the border or that side of the border? And I know of critics who have criticized Joginder Paul for not using pure Urdu, right? So, what would you have to say about that?
Like you rightly point out, there have been critics who have felt that, this Punjabi person writing Urdu is taking away from the Urdu that he is using. But the interesting thing is that Paul knew of this. It was he was aware of the fact that some of his Urdu usage was being deliberately used in a certain way that would actually show his Punjabi rootings, if you know what I mean. So, for instance, if you look at a story like Faktaen, which has been translated as the flight of the doves, he actually begins with this, kind of cheeky laugh at himself, at the critic, perhaps also, pointing to the reader that, the word that he uses there several times through the story is khariyat. It is not khairiyat. And he says that, he begins by saying, Sab khariyat to hai, and which means he's a very intelligent, self-conscious in a certain way. He knows what he is doing it. So it is not, as the critic would like to see it, as something that has slipped in without the knowledge of the writer. That is not it. And if we just look back perhaps even to Rahim Hassoon Raza, who's in Topi Shukla, Raza makes the character play with these words. He says pir and fir. So these are politics of languages, usages in different locales, which the writer is actually aware of, and they are bringing it into their writing. So so this is, and in Paul, interestingly, Sukrita, yeah, there is of course Punjabi, and in stories like Parai, there's this word "ni." It's continuously coming into the story. I was reminded of it when Kirti was mentioning "vai hai,"
Like,
and "vai hai," and this "ni." It's a Punjabi word. It's coming into an Urdu story, and very beautifully, by placing the characters in a certain setup. Paul is actually making Punjabi a part of that Urdu, or Urdu a part of that Punjabi local. So he's doing it very, very intelligently. That is how I would look at it. So if the critic were to differ with him, then the critic is perhaps somewhere missing out a point.
But
you
what
know
about the translator? What about the translator? What are the challenges?
well,
How do you bring in
yeah.
that admixture? Right?
Yeah, true. And there are many English words that Paul uses as well, which many of our other writers are also doing. So when we translate, it is really a very fine balance. It's literally like walking on a narrow bridge. You're very, very scared you'll be falling off very soon. And so it's like almost a moment by moment decision that we have to take as translators, also as editors. And particularly in Paul's case, I would like to say, as an editor, I think he manages to give me the tools to sharpen my own insight into language use more than as a translator. Of course, as a translator, I do that. But when I'm looking at it at a slight remove and looking at another translator's work, I think, I become far more conscious of how he has used that language in the original, and how are we to convey that into English, where it should not, this local fullness, this local flavor, essence. How do we convey it in such a way that we convey the fullness, not make it reductive by overuse? We don't over refine on the one hand, but we try and bring in, how do I, in a story which uses Punjabi and English and Urdu, perhaps some sort of a Hindi, how do we as translators manage to convey that? And there's no easy answer for this, Sukrita. It is very difficult. Somewhere we use, let's say, that word "ni." Somewhere we use that word "ni" and explain it somehow. Not explain it, but use a kind of equivalence which will give that tonality, which will give that sound of, that closeness between the characters who are using that word, or even the emotion of the character at that particular point.
Yeah.
And I think we keep trying it all the time. We are working at it.
Yeah. I think it's extremely important to actually go into the problematics in a deep fashion, in terms of translation, in particular into English from all these languages, and particularly of the times, writers of the times that we are talking about, where they were very consciously or not consciously and yet authentically presenting their characters and the locale in as real a fashion as possible through the use of the right language, the appropriate language. They were making their choices. And we as translators, I think it would be really blasphemous in a way to level it out as kind of in standard English, just in the by way of saying that it is readability that will suffer. Unfortunately, a lot of emphasis is put on readability because we do not want to make it awkward, we say, because even now, even in today's the as Vibha rightly said, because in the original English, writers they have started doing it. They are doing it. They have been doing it. Well, for instance, even Arundhati Roy and Salman Rushdie is even talking about chutneyfication and so on. So those liberties are being taken. But as translators, in the name of fidelity, we sort of try to, or rather readability, we are very conscious and our publishers are very conscious. And I think it's time that we should feel empowered enough to play and abuse English language in the way the writers did. Abuse English language, I would say, because we are playing with it. And let it be called an abuse, but the fact is that awkwardness is going to make it more ultimately, real. It's that awkwardness has to be naturalized, seen as a natural phenomenon, because it is a different kind of English. There is already a lot of talk that has happened about many Englishes within the country, just as we talk about many Hindis. So, as translators, we need to feel empowered. We need to identify these problematics the way that we are talking about. And as we problematize, obviously some solutions will come. We will feel stronger in dealing with these situations. And I'm sure there would be more and more publishers asking for that kind of translation then, rather than shunning it in the name of readability. I thank you very much. I think we have overshot our time, perhaps by 9 or 10 minutes, but I don't care. We have done it. And thank you so much, Chandana. Thank you, Vibha. Thank you, Kirti.
Thank you.
I think we have just about started to, engage with some of these ideas, and we can probably take them on in larger seminars, webinars, whatever we might wish to call them. But I think we need these debates more and more. We need reviewers who are educated in the problematics of translation so that they are able to deal with the reviews in a more authentic fashion, and give us not solutions but give us the license to use our discretion and make the choices. It's often said translator has all the choices. Translation is a matter of choices. But give us these choices, or let us really take them into our own fold, use these choices, and create readers to understand what is the original by being authentic to the use of language. Thank you, all of you. And we need to definitely thank Kalinga Literary Festival, Bhasha Utsav, for giving us this platform and also giving us a chance to deal with these questions as we raise them, and without sometimes giving any solutions. It's in the raising of questions that the search for solutions starts. And we will have one or two more sessions in KLF over time. We will make the announcement soon. But yes, this is giving us that opportunity to deal with issues that we are coming across as we are engaged in the Writer in Context series, in the making of the books, and in also with our engagement with the individual authors who come out of the same times. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Suprita.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Vibha, Kirti, dear.